Hello everyone, Kanasa here, and welcome back to a special episode of Kerbal Gets Real, the next Millenia, the first Mars landing of this series. With the second Mars fleet all assembled in low Earth orbit, including the new flagship model, the Olympus Super Tug Titan, the fleet prepares to depart for Mars on the 12th of October 2009. During this transfer window, the New Horizons Space Agency will be sending 8 separate missions to Mars, 6 of these tasked with rendezvousing with the previously established Ellis station to provide infrastructure to enable a crewed landing on the surface of Mars. The remaining 2 will be tasked with orbiting Phobos and Deimos to gather information on the resources these moons may hold. OST Titan burns its 3 NVGE engines for a solid 42 minutes before the instruction is given from Mission Control to terminate the burn. A slight trajectory correction is performed within Earth's sphere of influence in order to bring the spacecraft's final encounter to Mars below 400 kilometers. 7 months later, on the 24th of May 2010, Olympus Fleet 1 returns to Earth. The 5 tugs Janus, Iapetus, Pan, Hyperion, and Pandora perform a capture burn to place them into a highly elliptical Earth orbit in order to fix their inclination to the most optimal for future transfer windows to Mars. Upon completing the burn, the first fleet remains dormant until the next useful interplanetary transfer window. Prior to this, the tugs will be refueled in orbit, and new payloads will be docked to the spacecraft. With the return of Olympus Fleet 1, the New Horizons Space Agency has proven it possible to create a reusable system to ferry large payloads to and from Mars orbit. After nearly a year of being in transit, the first of the second fleet to Mars arrives on the 2nd of September 2010. The first mission to arrive is the PDSS, the Phobos or Deimos scanning satellite, one of 2 identical missions intended for an orbit around both of Mars's moons. Upon reaching perihelion, PDSS-1 fires up the advanced OTV engine and captures into a Mars orbit. A further series of burns are performed in order to put the probe's trajectory on an encounter course with Phobos. After just a day in Mars orbit, PDSS-1 begins its final approach to Phobos. The probe decouples from its transfer stage and performs an insertion into Phobos orbit. On the 3rd of September, a Phobos orbit is achieved, and PDSS-1 turns on its high-tech scanning systems in order to search for resources that may future benefit the crew of Ellis Station. Just 1 day later, PDSS-2 begins its capture burn at perihelion. Once again, a series of maneuvers are performed in Mars orbit. More fuel is required to get the encounter with Deimos, so the transfer stage is decoupled before reaching the sphere of influence of the small moon. After 4 days in Mars orbit, the probe finally reaches Deimos and does a quick burn to perform its orbital insertion. A couple of days later, on the 10th of September, the first of the new fleet of Olympus tugs arrives at Mars. Olympus Tug Rhea, its payload being the Ellis Station Nexus lander. Currently unfueled, the lander is a reusable design intended to ferry up to 6 crew from Ellis Station to the surface, making use of a single sea-level Raptor engine to propulsively land. Fuel for the lander will be later provided by shipments of Methalox en route to Mars on 3 separate Olympus tugs. Upon reaching its closest approach to Mars, Rhea maintains a retrograde attitude in preparation of beginning its orbital insertion. The single NVGE engine ignites and burns for 4 minutes, placing the tug and lander into a highly elliptical Mars orbit. At apoarion, the engine ignites again, correcting the spacecraft's inclination and matching planes with Ellis Station. A series of maneuver burns are then performed to put Rhea onto an encounter with the space station. Upon close approach, the ESNL decouples from the tug and begins docking procedures. Moving at only 0.2 meters per second, the lander slowly approaches the station. Upon completing docking, Rhea fires up its NVGE engine again, putting it into a much higher Mars orbit in preparation for its journey home. After having spent 344 days in the emptiness of deep space, the crew on board the Hammerhead transfer vehicle have finally arrived at Mars. Hitching a ride on top of OT Dione, the spacecraft reaches its closest encounter on the 12th of September and begins its capture burn. The sequence is completely automated, so Errol Tietjen, Evan David, Mark Sputnik, Phineas Masters, Boris Bogvadze, and Hernan Cortez take this opportunity to witness the breathtaking sight of Mars from the two cupola modules on the transfer vehicle. The engine on Dione cuts after a 6-minute burn, placing it into a lower but still highly elliptical orbit in order to rendezvous with the space station as quickly as possible, so the crew on board are able to replenish supplies used on the transfer to Mars. Upon reaching Ellis Station, the Olympus tug performs a burn to kill relative velocity, before the transfer vehicle undocks and proceeds towards it. The crew are given their first good view of their home for the next few years. They won't be leaving at the next transfer window to ensure Ellis Station is crewed at all times. Using only the RCS thrusters mounted on the MHTV, the approach to the station takes some time. This gives the crew on board the chance to run their final checks before their docking completes, and ensures that no spinning shenanigans are to take place. With supplies on the vehicle running low, it's vitally important a successful docking occurs. The MHTV completes its transition to Ellis Station, and not even an hour later, the next Olympus tug arrives at its closest Mars encounter. Its payload, the Phobos and Deimos excursion vehicle, is a vessel designed to transfer the crew of the station to the two moons of Mars. OT Phoebe begins its 4-minute capture burn, expending 800 meters per second of delta V to once again place the tug and payload into an elliptical Mars orbit to ensure the maneuvers required to rendezvous with the space station are as efficient as possible. The PDEV runs on different fuel from the Nexus lander, so Phoebe has brought along 2 large Hydrolox tanks to allow for 4 separate round trips to either Phobos or Deimos. Future missions to Mars will bring extra Hydrolox to ensure the vessel can always visit the moons. Further in the future, New Horizons Space Agency plans to utilise in situ resource utilisation to produce the Hydrolox required for the vehicle at Mars. Phoebe performs the necessary burns in order to gain an encounter with Ellis Station. With its payload being one of the heavier payloads out of these missions, the delta V margins are tight for Phoebe's return to Earth, so maximum efficiency is required when plotting a course for the station. The tug, however, eventually arrives at Ellis Station, and the payload is separated from Phoebe. The PDEV then uses its advanced OTV engine to finalise its approach, burning just for a few seconds in order to bring its encounter below 200 meters. The two sections are then separated, and automated docking instructions are sent to each separate module of this mission. The Hydrolox tanks are the first to dock to the station, with the crewed vehicle following shortly after. Because of the confined nature of the space station, the vessel collides with one of the centrifuges during its docking procedure. No damage is caused to the station, however. Once the vessel docks, the crew on board investigate the PDEV and discover something disastrous. The collision with the space station has damaged the carbon dioxide scrubbers on the vehicle beyond repair, rendering the entire vehicle inoperable. On the 15th of September 2010, the first of 3 Methalox depots for Ellis Station arrives on board Olympus tug Mimas. This payload contains the structure to allow fuel to be docked to the station, as well as 3 tanks partially filled with Methalox. Mimas completes its initial burn, and maneuvers are plotted to bring it on a close encounter with the station. The tanks are only partially filled so that they can be sent on an original Olympus tug. Despite only having 1/3 of their volume used, the overall mass of this payload nears 180 tons. That is definitely approaching the upper limit of an Olympus tug, and is an insane amount of fuel to be sending over to Mars. With the arrival of all 3 depots, the Nexus lander should be able to perform 4 separate landings on the surface. After performing several maneuvers, Mimas has now encountered Ellis Station, and the explosive payload is decoupled. Before docking procedures are initiated, Mimas performs one final burn to leave the vehicle in a higher Mars orbit. Returning to the Methalox fuel depot, the 3 tanks are decoupled, and one by one they are docked to the main structure. Each tank has a dedicated avionics unit to ensure full control when performing docking, and a store of monomethyl hydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide in order to realise this control. Upon the last tank coupling to the main structure, the now assembled craft moves to dock with the station. Moving at just 0.1 meters per second, the dock is a lengthy one. However, precaution must be taken to avoid colliding these large fuel reserves with a crewed space station. We really don't want any casualties out here. The docking is a complete success, and fortunately no Kerbal was harmed. 2 days later, on the 18th of September, Tethys arrives, bringing with it an identical payload of Methalox. Once again, several maneuvers are performed in orbit of Mars to bring the tug on an encounter course with Ellis Station, including an inclination change at Apu Arian. After another day, on the 19th of September, Tethys finally reaches its target and performs a burn to slow its relative velocity. It then releases the second MFD, which proceeds to dock to the station without any assembly in this case. A quick burn sends OT Tethys to a higher orbit before the 3 tanks are decoupled from the structure of the station. Upon individual separation, the crew reports the tanks visibly dancing as if some phantom force was holding them together. After a short period, the tanks are free, and an instruction is sent to dock all 3 in tandem. The docking autopilot undergoes a critical failure as one of the tanks fails to dock. The engineers on board the station, with quick thinking, override the procedure and guide the last tank in manually. Fortunately for them, they don't have to deal with any signal delay. With that crisis averted and all 6 tanks now successfully docked, a slight rearrangement of the station is in order. The MHTV is moved to a new docking port and its orientation corrected to allow space for the remaining Methalox tanks. With 5 of the 6 missions now having arrived, the main structure of Ellis Station is finally complete. All that remains is the last of the fuel for the lander to arrive. On the 20th of September 2010, the last of Mars Fleet 2 arrives. Its payload, 450 tons of Methalox, brought over on Olympus super tug Titan. The 3 engines fire up for 5 minutes, capturing the spacecraft into a Mars orbit. The 4 Methalox tanks brought over on Titan are fully fueled. Once these are docked to the station, the combined mass will reach almost 1,500 tons, an incredibly large amount in orbit of Mars. In order to prevent the methalox boiling off, the tanks are protected with a large amount of multi-layer insulation and large radiators. With this setup, no methalox fuel was lost in transit to Mars. New Horizons Space Agency realizes this may not be the most sustainable of endeavors, so, as with the Hydrolox for the PD-EV, development is currently ongoing to explore ISRU options. Titan has, however, now encountered the space station, and the 4 remaining Methalox tanks are decoupled from the Super Tug. Rather than sending the 4 new tanks direct to the station, the empty fuel holding structure is undocked and proceeds towards the newly released Methalox. The 4 tanks are separated, much more cleanly than the previous dancing tanks, and an instruction is sent to dock all 4 to the arriving fuel structure. Once all 4 have successfully connected, the structure returns to the station, proceeding with great care. Having moved the MHTV previously, there is now ample space for docking this unwieldy structure, and after a short while, the last of Mars Fleet 2 is finally connected. Ellis Space Station is now a fully armed and operational battle it's now complete. And with that, it's time to bring crew down to the surface for the first time. On the 22nd of September 2010, Hernan Cortez, Phineas Masters, Mark Sputnik, and Boris Bogvardzy retire from their habitation in the station's centrifugal rings and board the Nexus lander. The spacecraft uses its RCS system to softly decouple from the station and to retreat to a safe distance. Blasting the engine too close to Ellis Station is a big no-no. After traversing a couple of 100 meters, the lander fires up its Raptor engine, lowering its orbits from the stations at 450 kilometers down to 150 kilometers in preparation for its final descent onto the surface. The change in orbit is to allow better guidance for the spacecraft's landing target, a large icy crater close by to the North Pole of Mars. The ESNL deploys the 4 large air brakes to provide stability and help slow the vessel during its descent through the Martian atmosphere. 70 kilometers above the surface, the spacecraft fires up the Raptor again, one last time before hopeful touchdown on the surface. The single engine provides a mildly uncomfortable acceleration of 2.5 G for the crew on board at full throttle, so for the majority of the descent, the engine is set to half throttle to prevent the crew from redecorating the interior of the spacecraft. The target crater certainly looks much larger this close, and the crew on board now check their instruments to locate a suitable landing zone, preferably not on a gigantic slope. A landing zone is decided upon, and the crew buckle themselves in for the final descent. 4 hours after decoupling from the station, no parachutes are used to slow the craft. This is so additional parachutes are not required for future landings, saving on extra parts and making the design fully reusable with additional shipments of fuel. The landing gear are deployed, and with a soft bump the craft touches down. For the first time in 40 years and this millennia, a crew has been sent to the Martian surface. The ESNL lands just a few hundred meters from the icy crater, and using onboard cameras, transmits breathtaking images of the local landscape. The crew remains in the capsule for a day, preparing themselves for the moments to come. After all safety checks have been performed, Hernan Cortez disembarks, climbs down the ladder, and becomes the first Kerbal from New Horizons Space Agency to set foot on the surface of Mars. Just a few moments later, the remaining crew, Phineas Masters, Mark Sputnik, and Boris Bolgvardze, join Hernan Cortez outside the lander. The crew departed the lander just as the sun was setting over the horizon, so in order to get a better visual of the surrounding landscape, they first take a long trek up the nearest hill, so that once again they can use the sunlight to help them with their observations. The planned duration for their stay at the crater is 30 days. The lander has enough life support to sustain 6 crew for just over a month. Upon reaching the top of the ridge, the 4 Kerbals take in the sights and gaze over at the vista led before them. The crew's mission objective is to study the crater for potential landing sites for a future surface base, and determine how viable ice mining operations may be. The view from the top of the crater certainly makes this area a potential site, but over the course of the next 30 days, the crew will have to perform expeditions deeper into the crater. With the Kerbals' lust for a good view satisfied, Boris Bolgvardze steps forward and plants a flag, to stake the site as explored and to leave a marker for potential future visits. As all good Kerbals do, they gaze fondly at the flag for the next 20 minutes, reminiscing over snacks, or high-G maneuvers, or whatever Kerbals do best. But eventually, they decide, with the flag placed firmly into the Martian soil, they must depart the location to return to the Nexus lander. If they are to descend deeper into the crater, they'll need additional equipment on board. Hopefully, this won't require them dismantling the ESNL, as all parts are needed for their return to Mars orbit. It's just a short 800-meter walk back to the lander though. Despite this, the journey, however, is dangerous. The uneven terrain makes every step uncertain, and any fall could lead to catastrophic consequences. The crew remain on the surface for just over a month, collecting all sorts of data, surface samples, and information for the New Horizons Space Agency design teams to analyse for future permanent presence on Mars. With their trip completed, the crew prepare for departure and rendezvous with Ellis Station. No dust storm has forced us to leave a Kerbal behind, and with all crew accounted for, the Raptor engine fires up to begin its ascent into a polar orbit around Mars, in the plane of the space station. The ascent is uneventful, and after 5 minutes of burning, the lander kills the engine as the Nexus finds itself again in Mars orbit, still with more than enough Delta V remaining to perform a quick burn to put it onto an encounter with the station. The lander has to rendezvous with the station in a timely manner, as the supplies on the ESNL are running short. Being in a low orbit, the Nexus is able to catch the station in good time, and 36 days after their departure, the crew once again catches sight of the formidable structure in low Mars orbit. The lander slows its relative velocity to almost a standstill, and the go-ahead to dock the 2 craft is given. With the return of the Nexus, New Horizons Space Agency has finally realised its dream of sending crew to the surface of Mars and returning them safely, as long as the trip back to Earth goes okay. And unfortunately, that will be it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed the more cinematic, narrative style that I went for in this one. It's something I don't do all the time, but I thought first Mars landing of this series, probably a good time to do something like that. And I am considering doing this same episode, but with my more normal voiceover as a sort of director's cut to show you my thoughts and processes into this video. If you would like to see that, please leave a comment below letting me know. I might do a poll on YouTube as well, just to gauge the interest in that. I do want to say the next episode of this that I will release probably won't be out for quite some time, as I am starting university again, and I'm going to have to go in and design a whole load of new missions, because I'm finished with all of the designs that I've done so far. So hopefully I want to get one of these squeeze out a month or thereabouts, but we'll see how that goes. But anyway, thank you for watching this video, and I've been Karnasa, and I will see you later.